Many of us say it's dying we fear, not death. Ron Delbane, nationally known spiritual director and teacher based in Birmingham, Alabama, teaches us that God is present in dying as in living. Knowing this, we can embrace the dying process and be fully there for each other.
In the process of death and dying, it's not uncommon to experience moments for which there are no words. Some people are more aware of these moments than others. Some are afraid of them. Some talk about sensing God's presence. To explore the sacred in death and dying is to be alert to the holy, to be aware of those sacred moments, and to look for the deeper meaning. Every death has a story. For the healing process to truly begin, people need to tell their story. I was visiting the hospital one afternoon, and a nurse came out of the room and said, "Please, would you go down to the waiting room and talk to Mrs. Smith? Her husband just passed away, and she's down there by herself." I went down to the waiting room and walked in, said, "Mrs. Smith, my name is Ron Delbane. I'm an Episcopal priest. The nurse told me your husband just passed away and asked me to come and talk with you." Mrs. Smith looked up and said, "But I'm Presbyterian." We both smiled, and I said, "That's all right, I speak Presbyterian." She immediately said, "What will I tell my boys? What will I tell my boys? They're on their way over here. They shooed me out of the room before he died." I said, "Just a minute." I left and got the nurse, told her the situation, and she said, "Oh, he had died before we took her out of the room, but you know, we have to do so many things after they die, and we just didn't want her to be there." I said, "Then you need to come down and tell her." The nurse came down and told her that she in fact had been with her husband when he died, and died without pain. As the nurse left, Mrs. Smith turned to me and said, "Now I have something to tell my boys." It was important for Mrs. Smith to have a story to tell. Death touches each one of us in a unique kind of way. In this part of the video program, we will be hearing people tell their stories of the many faces of death. Let's hear Patrick talk about his friend Lee.
The death was quiet, so quiet it was startling, in that he had trouble breathing from Sunday on, and it was a very labored breathing and loud. And all of a sudden, it was no longer there. The noise, the difficulty of him trying to catch his breath wasn't there. And it happened a couple of times, and he would breathe again. And then at one point, he just stopped and was at peace. And that's when a group of his friends that had been set aside specifically to handle the end took things into their own hands and prepared him the way he wanted to be prepared.
The telling of stories is an important key in the exploring the sacred of death and dying. Each person's story becomes a piece of their life, a sacred piece that they tell over and over. It is one way of moving through the hurt and a way for us to see another face of death. Brooke tells us a story about the death of her best friend, Alex.
Alex was 21 years old and passed away from complications due to Hodgkin's disease. He was, in fact, it was about this time last year, 2 years ago in fact, that he found a lump on his neck and had a biopsy and came back malignant, and then due to complications with testing, his heart just then failed on him 2 weeks later. And that last week with him and watching him go through that and his family go through really just the uncertainty. No one ever expected it to be that quick. And but I guess the most profound day of all was the Friday. He died on Good Friday, but indeed about 2:30 or 3 that afternoon, we realized that it was imminent, and that the decision to take him off life support that was made earlier in the day was going to have to take place. He died at 4:44 that afternoon, and it wasn't until that moment that that you thought about yourself at all and thought about dealing with the aftermath. But it was amazing. We were talking to him, things that I couldn't say now. I mean, I can't say now, but at the time you could do, because you were so focused on him. And it was amazing. But it was very peaceful. It's the most peaceful moment I've ever lived.
Both Brooke and Patrick had their stories to tell because they were present at the time of death. In some instances, someone may not be present. When my father-in-law died, my brother-in-law Tom was present. He said he went over to the bed and knelt down. He cried. He said, I then made the sign of the cross on Pop's forehead and said, Pop, I love you. Goodbye. And I got up to leave. He said, then I became aware that my other brothers and sisters were not able to be there. So I went back, I knelt down, and starting with the oldest, Mark, I made the sign of the cross and said, for Mark, Pop, goodbye, I love you, and went through all my brothers and sisters. I remember when Eleanor got the call, she turned to me and said, oh, honey, it was like I was there. I now have a story to tell. I've shared that story so often with families, especially when someone in the family will not be able to be there at the time of death, so that they can take the place of someone who would not be there, so that they too have their story to tell. Although Eleanor was not able to be with her father when he died, she was able to be with her mother at the time of her death.
I was laying there in bed and I thought, well, just be in a deep place of prayer with Mother. And it was the strangest feeling. It was like I could feel life start to go out of my feet, and I could feel life going out of my lower legs. And it was like, it's time. Life is moving out of her body. And so I jumped out of bed and went back and sat with her. And she again said, help me. And I said, Mother, I'm here with you. And I represent all your children here with you. And I can't help you. I can't do it for you. That this one you do alone. You're on your own. And it's time. And just be aware of Mary and everybody gathered around. And we're all here to support you in doing what you alone can do. And I think it's time. So she rested a little, and then I heard this strange sound like she was coughing. It's like Mamie, who was there with me. We lifted her up a little. And then it was a sound that I'd never heard before, and I knew it was the death rattle. So I said to Mamie, let's just rest her back in her bed. And we did, and she closed her eyes, and I heard her say, Mary. And she gave one final breath, and that was it. And she was gone. I prayed 3 Hail Marys out loud with her because I knew that was her journey home prayer. And then kissed her and gave her the blessing of all her children. And I felt that in her dying and her moving into new life, I was born again somehow. And that in those final years of sharing with me, she gave me life. And whole new parts of myself I'd never known before came to life. And I finally had the kind of sharing I'd always yearned for with my mother.
Not all stories have beautiful endings. Some stories have very painful endings. But whether the stories are beautiful or painful, they are still a story of one of the many faces of death. And the more those stories are told, the more we move through our grief and move through into new life. The important thing is that we are able to tell our story.
I find myself always wanting to talk about it and always needing to sort of go through the event itself, which is still curious to me as to why I feel that need to talk about the event. You run out of ears. That's the only thing. You run out of ears. And so you find yourself just running through it in your head a lot. I don't know why. I don't know where the need comes from. I guess it is trying to make it reality, or why didn't I do this, or why didn't I do that?
Part of the exploration of the sacred for both the teller and the listener is the story. Although, as Brooke found out, sometimes there are not enough ears to listen, sometimes there are not even ears willing to listen. Let me tell you about Dorothy and Bill. Dorothy awoke one morning to find her husband Bill dead in the bed next to her. In the flurry of all the preparations for the funeral, and afterwards, she went and stayed with her son for a month. When she came back home, we were sitting in our living room talking. I said, "Dorothy, tell me about that morning." She began to sob and said, "Oh, Ron, thank you for asking. I've been so wanting to tell the story, but my children wouldn't hear anything about it. They said, no, we want to remember Daddy as he was. They wouldn't let me tell the story. And I knew I had to. It's the only way to get beyond it." What stories about death have you been able to tell? Or do you still have some untold stories? No matter what we believe about life after death, or about this world and another world, I believe that there is a thin curtain between those two worlds. One Sunday, after church, Susan, a parishioner, said to me, "Ron, I've just got to talk about Aunt Harriet." I visited her in the nursing home the other day, and she said, "Well, did you see Uncle Floyd? He just left. You must have passed him in the hallway." "Ron, Uncle Floyd has been dead for 10 years. What do I do now? Is she really losing it?" I responded, "Susan, in my experience, it's not been uncommon for people as they move toward death to experience those who've already died, either coming to them in a dream or what they perceive to be truly present there with them." She said, "Well, what do I do?" "Well, I would suggest that the next time you're with her, and she mentions whether you'd seen Uncle Floyd, you might ask, 'Well, what did you talk about when he was here?'" She looked at me with incredulity and said, "Really?" And I said, "Yes." Well, a week later she came and said, "I've got to tell you what happened." She said, "I did that." She said, again, "Did you see Uncle Floyd in the hallway?" And I said, "Well, no, but what did Uncle Floyd and you talk about?" She said, "Well, he told me that our new house was going to be ready soon." I said, "What new house?" He said, "Well, the one on 4th Street, you silly." Susan said, "Ron, they moved into that house some years ago before he died." And I said, Susan, the next time, tell her that if Uncle Floyd comes again, talks about taking her home to the new house, why doesn't she just go with him? That you all will be fine if she decides to go and live with him in the new house." And I said that may be God's way of calling Aunt Harriet home. Well, Harriet died. After she died, I was sitting with Susan and said, "Tell me the story." She ended the story by saying, "And it's uncanny. When I went back to the nursing home, I told her what you told me about going with Uncle Floyd." She said, "And Ron, that night, she died." I believe there is a thin curtain between the two worlds.
I've learned to listen better and to enter into the stories that I'm told, even if they're not always of this time and space. Sometimes people will talk of seeing their mother or their husband or family, and I've learned to say, "Well, tell me more about that. Tell me," and it kind of brings together all those moments together. I remember a woman that told me she saw Jesus walking down the halls, and when I looked at her face, I wasn't sure she really hadn't seen somebody. So I said, well, tell me about him. Tell me, do you see him? And she looked down the hall, and then she got this disappointed look in her eye, and she said, "Oh, he turned the other way." I've learned that the curtain between living and dying is much more porous than I ever realized.
It is important to talk about those experiences which are outside the normal realm of our experience. Some people find that that thin curtain is porous, or certainly more porous than they had thought. But these experiences are not uncommon. As a result of her illness, My own daughter Anne has had near-death experiences, about which she tells amazing stories.
My thought was, you know, it'd be okay not to breathe. You know, it's time for a rest. It's time for a rest. And so I had that thought, and about as soon as I had that thought, I was standing at my feet, and there was just a beam of light next to me, and we're having this conversation, but a conversation without words. So I don't know if you'd actually call it a conversation, but and I was standing there in a very matter of fact. I was standing, which was very different from it. I'm like, oh, okay, well, this is cool. And I was standing there at my feet and looking at this person on the floor, and it's like I didn't feel any connection with her really, and I was like, man, she's having a rough time. You know, I mean, that was my thought. Gee whiz, she's really having a rough time. And then it was like, well, I'll just remember her, you know. I'll just pray for her and be present in prayer with her. And I was like, okay. And then I was off and floating through the clouds and just kind of wandering around. And before, when I had a near-death experience, it was always, well, I always had a choice whether to come back or not. And I was like, what had brought me back before was I always wanted to see another sunrise or another sunset. And so when I was in the clouds and the trees and everything, and I was like, you know, it'd be okay if I didn't see another sunrise or another sunset in the same way I had seen it before. That'd be okay. And I was like, okay, well then, I guess I'm ready. And then I remembered something, and I remembered that I had promised a friend of mine that I would not die on him. And that friend was actually with me that day. He was holding my hand. And I remembered, wait a minute, you know. And then I was back at my feet, and I was staying with this being of light again, and it's like, you know, I made that promise. And I was staying there, and I was watching Steve pound on my chest and yelling at me to breathe, you know, saying, breathe, Ann, breathe. And I was like, you know, I promised him, and I choose to keep that promise. And as soon as I thought that, I was back in my body and just took a deep breath and was back in my body.
The basic belief I have is that no matter where the experiences come from, for the person who is experiencing them, they are real. And so our task is to be present with them and to help them discover more of what God is calling them to. In Brooke's experience, her perception is that her best friend Alex was met by his father Doug, who had died some time before.
It very much felt like his dad came and truly met him. And there was a great comfort in knowing that his dad was there to meet him. The comfort that his mother felt, that Alex's mother felt, and being able to sort of hand off Alex to Doug it was like a family experience. And it was amazing.
One part of the mystery of life after death that is commonly believed is that those who have died before us will be there to greet us. This brings comfort to many, as it did to Maggie's twin sister, Libby.
There came a point when I finally said to her one day, I asked her how she felt about the fact that she probably was going to die soon. And she looked at me and she said, well, I really want to see my kids grow up. She said, that really, really hurts me a lot. I want to see my children grow up. But her fear was the actual physical act of dying is what scared her. And the only words that came to me were that she would be fine, that the Lord would just take her hand, and that Dad was there, and my other sister was there, and she would be fine. And she was good with that.
One of the most impressive things I've experienced over the years of working with people in death and dying and their friends and families has been the power of remembrance. And that power of remembrance is expressed in telling the stories, in sharing about the thin curtain between the worlds, in repeating the stories again and again, and sometimes in those more formal ways that our religious heritage may provide for us, as Jane experiences in her Jewish heritage.
In all services, you say a prayer called the Kaddish, and the Kaddish, it says nothing about death in it. It's all about extolling and sanctifying God, but it's said at the moment, the precise moment when the congregation rises, the list of people who have died and been buried that week, or whose anniversary of their death falls at that time. Their names are read out loud, you remember them, and then you say this prayer, this Kaddish prayer. It's a wonderful moment when everyone supports one another. The congregation is there as a family, and it's almost as if those prayers are swirling around and going up and right to God. I could almost see them sometimes, you know, the names and such. It's a very holy moment.
That holy moment is an experience of the sacred, just as the other stories we have heard. The stories, in fact, may not be within the realm of our normal experience, but just because we have not experienced them does not mean that they do not exist. Our role is to listen to the stories, to be supportive of the people, and to honor them in their experience of the holy. Have you had an experience of that thin curtain between the worlds, or do you know someone who has?